TorahCafe.com.
Rock of Ages, let our song praise your saving power. You amid the raging foes.
Tonight is the fifth night of Hanukkah, a favorite holiday, especially for children. And if you've been paying attention, you couldn't miss the grand outdoor menorah in your city. In thousands of public spaces around the world, none more prominent than the national menorah at the White House, the Red Square in Moscow, parliament buildings throughout Europe. Grand public menorahs are illuminated, often by city and state officials who climb up on cherry pickers to kindle the flames. At the foot of the menorah, people on the street join in the dancing as donuts and latkes, symbols of this holiday, make the rounds. It wasn't always like this. Before 1975, when the first public menorah went up in San Francisco's Union Square, the idea of a public menorah was inconceivable. Jews at the time shied away from public displays of religious observance, the better to blend in. Absent the kinds of holiday celebrations we have today, Jewish children could only look on wistfully at the colorful seasonal displays, while Hanukkah was a poorly known, poorly celebrated holiday. As a holiday that celebrates the triumph of Jewish identity and Jewish continuity at a time when these were threatened by hostile forces, Hanukkah is as good a time as any to ask ourselves the question, how are we doing? Today, we'll get the perspectives of some individuals who seem to have their fingers on the pulse of Jewish trends. Harvard professor Alan Dershowitz, one of our country's most outspoken attorneys and civil rights advocates, has written prolifically on Israel and Jewish identity. Mr. Malcolm Hoenlein, chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, monitors Jewish trends in the Jewish community. And Rabbi Yitzchok Schochet, a pulpit rabbi in London, England. I began with Mr. Dershowitz, who 10 years ago, in his book, The Vanishing American Jew, raised alarm bells about Jews disappearing to assimilation. I asked him, has anything changed over the course of the past decade?
I think there have been some positive changes. Look, assimilation, tragically, is a fact of life. It's always been a fact of Jewish history. For certain generations, Jews didn't assimilate because they couldn't assimilate. Nobody wanted them. Today, for better or worse, everybody wants to marry a Jew, except apparently another Jew. So there's going to be intermarriage, and the only way to stop intermarriage is to make one's Jewishness so central to their lives that they can't imagine sharing their life with a partner who didn't share their love of Judaism. It's not going to work. The guilt won't work. The grandparental guilt, that doesn't work anymore. The guilt and the guilt don't work. I won't inherit you. I feel guilty. The only way we're going to have Jews marry other Jews is to make Jewishness so central, so important to their life. It was, for me, I got married a second time very late in life. I had many options, but it would be inconceivable for me not to marry a woman who shared my passion for my Judaism and my Jewishness.
When it comes to the idea of living Jewish lives, that is not subject to compromise. And who we are, how we live, those are things that we should be demonstratively proud of and be able to show in full ways.
I'm reminded of a story I once heard about my dear father, who lectured extensively across the globe against missionary cults. Someone once asked the question, Rabbi, how will I know when I've walked into a Jews for J temple, which will typically be disguised to look like the real thing, and when I am walking into a real authentic synagogue? To which he replied, when you walk in and you are warmly greeted and embraced, and you're given a book and a seat, then in all likelihood you will have wandered into one of theirs. But when you are pretty much ignored, have to make your own way, and the only exchange you have is with the person who tells you you're sitting in my seat, then you'll know you're most likely in the real McCoy. This is not intended as an indictment on Judaism, but it expresses the point that we have to be much more warm and welcoming. The fact that cults will go out of their way and spend literally tens of thousands of dollars just in the hope of capturing but one soul, and so much more on their overall agenda. If we look to spend just a fraction of that, if people would look to invest more in that, if we would expend even just some of that energy in being more warm and welcoming, then we would go a long way to making Judaism more appealing to the next generation. Give them a reason to belong. Give them a reason to be innovative. Give them a reason to want to be a part of this great nation.
We do not do enough and do not give the priority to experiential Judaism, to giving them Jewish experiences, positive experiences, to enable young people to identify. And you know what? If you give them a wide choice, you give them the opportunity, once they start identifying, they will find more and more about the richness of Judaism, of all that it has to offer. Not by imposition, but because they will want to know more and they will want to get more out of it.
You know, when my students come to me and say, I want to be a Buddhist, I say, you can be a Buddhist like within Judaism. There are elements that appeal to you from Buddhism within Judaism. There's everything within Judaism. You want the extremely rational side. You want to be a Jesuit. Okay, there are what the Jesuits study. Where do you think the Jesuits got it from? They got it from understanding and studying the Talmud. Where do you think many people who today looking for alternative ways got it from? They got it from the Kabbalah, they got it from the Zohar, they got it from other sources. Judaism is not singular, it's not just intellectual, it's not just the Vilna Gaon, it's also the Lubavitcher Rebbe. It's not just Mitnagdim, it's Hasidim. It's not just Ashkenazim, it's Sephardim. There's everything within the Jewish canon for a young person or even an older person to immerse themselves in. And my advice to students is start with Judaism. If you don't find the answers there, then you have the right to look elsewhere. But at the very least, your obligation, having been born a Jew, is to start with Jewish sources and see if you can find within the Jewish sources what you're looking for.
Which brings me to my next question. Do we need to be under threat to assert our identity? Isn't it true that when our freedoms to practice as Jews were threatened, we fought hard for those freedoms? But when we have the privilege to live as Jews, somehow we cherish it less and assimilate, if not by coercion, then by default.
I was in a taxi in Israel during the Lebanon War a few years back. The taxi driver turned to me and said in Hebrew, Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, is doing a mitzvah. And when I asked him what on earth he meant, he explained that he's uniting the Jewish people in Israel. Is that what it's come to? We need to face threats and persecution in order to band together? In order for people to join ranks and pull together?
I do not believe we should allow our enemies to define us. Pharaoh was the first one to call us a nation. We didn't see it ourselves. It's sometimes our enemies who define us and set for us often things that we should be setting for ourselves.
It goes without saying that in the physical reality, when we come under threat, that's when our survival instincts kick in. That's when we tap into previously unimaginable strengths and strive to persevere. In a very similar vein, when that Jewish spark which lies at the core of every Jew is threatened with being extinguished, it suddenly starts to flicker and sometimes it bursts into this wonderful flame of Jewish passion and fervor. How else do you explain the many previously unaffiliated Jews who are presented with the cross in the one hand and the sword in the other and being told, kiss this or this kisses you? How many of them gave up their lives? Because when it comes to the crunch, the Jew doesn't want to, nor can he tear himself from his roots in his source above. But does it have to come to that? And therein lays the tragic irony. In years gone by, Jews confronted all sorts of persecution, whether in Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia. And yes, this evoked within them a steadfast commitment to their faith. But you set them free, and what happens? We live in a land of precious liberty where we are able to practice religion freely, where laws are in place to protect our religious rights, where we can walk tall and proud. And yet it is then, when there is no real opposition, that we tend to drop the ball.
So while it is true that under threat we tend to firm up our resolve to assert our identity, that's hardly something to wish for. I asked our guests, what is it that we need to do to ensure a young generation that will want to take ownership of their Jewish identity?
All the statistics show that we're not moving in a better direction when it comes to Jewish identity. That we have a problem amongst young Jews. But part of the problem is that we haven't given them the positive things with which to identify. We do not talk about the glories, the victories, the joy of being a Jew. Too much of it is associated with tsaros, with negatives, with things that have occurred, which are important, that Jews look back and put an emphasis on history, not to dwell on the tsaros.
I do not like what I call the tsurist theory of Jewish survival, that we need threats to keep us together. I don't want threats, but I want Jews. So I want us to figure out a way of getting young people to love their Jewish heritage and their Jewish background without fear and without threats. Judaism has managed to survive and thrive after thousands of years of threats and persecution. We're in a new phase of Judaism. We have to borrow a phrase from my friend Rabbi Waldock's, we have to take the oi out of Judaism and put the J in front of it, the joy, back in Judaism. Chabad does that better than any other group on campus. They tell young people, come and be joyous with us.
And I think that there is a need for us to extol and to share the excitement about being a Jew today. That we're the generation that saw Kibbutz Goliath. We saw the ingathering of the exiles. We saw the Jews of Yemen, of Russia, of Syria, who had been written off to Jewish history, have all come home now. We have seen miracles of Jerusalem reunited under Jewish sovereignty, that the Temple Mount under Jewish sovereignty. Think of what our grandparents would have given to see any one of these things. And our generation has been given all of these miracles. We're the generation of miracles, not the generation of tsaras, if we appreciate them.
What about the horrible rise in anti-Israel, anti-Jewish sentiment? What is it that responsible Jewish leadership needs to do today to ensure that a young generation does not become intimidated and alienated by such hostility? Rabbi Schochet.
There is a very real crisis facing the modern-day young Jew with the rise of anti-Semitism, certainly in all parts of Europe, and no doubt spilling over into other parts of the world. It poses an altogether different and maybe unprecedented challenge. When a kid who previously wore his yarmulke proudly on public transport or in his non-Jewish school and wherever else besides is now being encouraged by parents and teachers alike to replace it with a baseball cap, well, what kind of message does that send out? How will that impact the Jewish identity of that child going forward? Do I really want to be bothered? Do I want to be overtly Jewish when it invites so much hassle and headache? I think that challenge is especially manifest today on university campuses where radicalism, as absurd as it is allowed to fester.
How many places bar Israeli speakers make it hard for them to speak? How many places are Jewish students under assault? How many difficulties that Jewish students don't register as Jewish anymore on campuses across the United States? That Walton Mearsheimer's textbook sold 1 million copies and is used from Harvard to the University of California.
Let's hear from Mr. Dershowitz.
I would not say there has been a spike of anti-Semitism on college campuses in the United States. Anti-Semitism is unacceptable on college campuses. If there's ever an anti-Semitic episode, it is dealt with on every college campus in America. That's not true in Europe. That's not true in England. It's not true in parts of even Australia, South Africa. But it is true in the United States. We haven't seen any real anti-Semitism. What we've seen is anti-Zionism, and sometimes the anti-Zionism by some extremists begins to morph into anti-Semitism. They talk about pushy Jews having too much control of the media.
Still 70 years after the Shoah, it's not politically correct yet to say openly, I hate Jews, though increasingly it is becoming acceptable. But it is acceptable to say, I hate Israel.
It's much more acceptable to be Jewish on a college campus today. When I started teaching at Harvard Law School, it was something that people were sometimes embarrassed about. In those days, people changed their names, they changed their noses, they changed their identity. One of the great professors of Jewish studies at Harvard, Wilson, infamously said many years ago, being a Jew is like having a hunchback. It's a burden you have to bear. That's no longer the case. Being a Jew is something that people are very proud of today on college campuses. Let me tell you where the problem lies. One major source of Jewish identification when I was first on college campuses, and even when I wrote my book, The Vanishing American Jew, was a proud association with Israel. That is changing. A lot of Jews on college campuses today are proud to be Jews, but they're not proud of their association with Israel. Israel has become harder to defend today than it was when I was growing up. When I was growing up, it was the War of Independence, it was the 67 War, the 73 War, the raid in Entebbe, the rescue, all the great heroic things that Israel did. Today, it's a much harder case. Today, it's the war in Lebanon, the war in Gaza, the occupation, the difficulties of making peace. So I don't blame the students on college campuses today. It's a harder case to make, and it's less popular. We have to do more to give the students the ammunition with which to embrace Israel.
We have to get into the 21st century in the use of media, social media, other means of reaching people, getting the truth out. Our enemy has it, we do not.
We have not yet used technology as well as we could to our advantage. I would like to see every single college and university in the world hooked together electronically so that when there is a breaking story about Israel, I can get on the television, Erwin Kartler can get on the television, Elie Wiesel can get on the television, Prime Minister Netanyahu can get on the television, Michael Oren can get on the television and present our point of view electronically and immediately in real time. We can't wait for the next news cycle.
You know, after the flotilla, it took days till they saw the film and people began to realize what Israel was really up against, who were the people on board those ships, that they were terrorists, what the nature of the enemy that we are confronting. But more and more people, especially in the Middle East, have come to understand it. They came to understand that Israel is not the source of instability. When Israel took out the Syrian nuclear reactor, not one Arab country condemned it. Why? Except for Syria, of course. Because they recognized that it was defending them. It was their security online. And so more people have come to terms with, at the same time that we see in Europe and around the world, the growing campaign of BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, and delegitimization in its many forms.
I do not see a future for Jewish communities in many parts of Europe today. I think that although the Shoah is over, Europe has become a relatively inhospitable place for many Jews. At least many parts of Europe have become inhospitable. Who would have imagined, though, 50 years ago, that Poland is more hospitable to Jews than France in some ways, and that it's easier to be an assertively Jewish Zionist in Poland and Lithuania than it is in Paris and London. So we're seeing dramatic changes. Thank God for Israel, because no matter what happens anywhere else in the world, Israel will always be a place where Jews have a home, where Jews will be welcomed with open arms. If that had only been the case in the 1930s and early 1940s, imagine how Jewish history would have been changed.
And the lesson of history is that it's not what they do, it's what we fail to do. It's we who give the license to our enemies. It's we who tolerate it. We keep raising the bar on what we're prepared to tolerate. 70 years ago, Jews said also the same thing. And in Mitzrayim, they said the same thing. We can live with it. We can live with it. And it wasn't until they said no more, then God said, now you're ready to be redeemed.
Everyone, it seems, agrees that a good Jewish education is the answer to a good Jewish identity. And while the debate about government funding for private school education remains unresolved and continues, many seem to think that might be the answer to the problem of Jewish education. The reality, however, is much more complicated. In fact, it was exactly a year ago today, on the 5th day of Hanukkah, that Britain's Supreme Court ruled that Jewish religious law is racist, and that it is the courts and not religious authorities who get to decide who is a Jew when determining admission policies for Jewish schools.
The most important constitutional provision for Jews in America is the First Amendment. The First Amendment makes us equal citizens. Without the First Amendment, we would not be equal citizens. This would be a Christian country. We would be here at the toleration of Christians. Within 100 years, this could be a Muslim country or a Latino country. But it will never be that, because the First Amendment says separation of church and state. Separation of church and state is expensive. It is not cheap. Let me tell you what happens when the government supports religious education. Look at what happened in England. The government supports religious education in England, and the government is now telling yeshivas that they must accept students who were born of a Jewish father but a non-Jewish mother. The government, when it supports education, tells the yeshiva what it can teach and what it can't teach. You can't have freedom, total freedom, when the government supports a religion.
The inevitable consequence of government-funded faith schools is that he who pays the piper calls the tunes. It worked for a long time, but as per the case in the United Kingdom demonstrates, you lay yourself wide open to all sorts of vulnerabilities. All of a sudden, the law mandates that you have to allow in anyone who chooses to define themselves as Jewish, even if in fact they are not. The flip side is that private schools then become cost prohibitive and people cannot afford to send their children, thus putting them into the mainstream public sector. So of course that begs the question, what then is the lesser of the two evils? I think the latter remains the better option, if only because what's the point of a government-funded school when you are compelled to blur the lines and ultimately defeat the whole purpose for which you set up the school in the first instance?
And so my answer is dig deep into our pockets. We're very good at that. We are a relatively affluent community. We should be willing to pay for Jewish education. You know, there are ways of getting some support from the government that doesn't interfere with the quality of education. The police are provided to protect our schools. There can be free secular textbooks available. There can be school buses. But I myself would be opposed to having the government involved in directing our curriculum and telling the yeshivas who they can admit, who they can't admit, what kinds of criteria are applied. Freedom is expensive, and we should be prepared to pay the price because we get a tremendous amount out of it.
What we need are perhaps what we should define as community schools. By definition, the community needs to appreciate the vital importance of education and look to channel more funding that way, as they might do with other social and welfare concerns. So if somebody can donate $20 million for the refurbishment of a synagogue, important as that may be, he should perhaps consider giving just $10 million and put the other monies towards subsidizing Jewish children to go into Jewish schools.
I would hope that many of the people who give $100 million gifts to universities would consider dividing it and giving equal amounts to the universities, but also equal amounts to Jewish education. That many of those who give to museums and to other things, all of which are worthwhile perhaps, but when you want to look in the long term, this is the better investment. I do believe there is enough money in the community if it were properly directed, if we could get people to give more, if we get parents to pay their share, and many will not be able to carry their full share, so it can be compensated by others in the community. You know, in Jewish law, the first thing a community must do is provide a Jewish education, even before shul and everything else. There isn't that sense of common responsibility that each of us become the parents of all the children in our communities, and any that lacks that education means that we have failed. So I would hope that not to look to government to take care of everybody's needs, and I don't believe that. I don't believe government. I think there are even negatives about the government playing too much of a role within the educational institutions. I do think, though, that we have to look at it, and I think that schools should be communal institutions, not private property. I think schools should be functioning under rules that hold to accountability, to see to it that funds are adequately both raised but properly dispersed, that we see that the needs in communities should be assessed, and that the leadership of the community should say, these schools have to do more. It has happened in places. There are schools in one community I know that didn't open because there were children who didn't have a place to go, and until every one of them was placed, they said no one would open. That, I think, is really leadership acting responsibly and effectively.
At the same time, let's not lose sight of parental responsibility. So go on one less holiday if that's what it takes. A week in the Bermuda versus a sound Jewish education that will last a lifetime is a no-brainer in my books.
There's an old expression, there's no such thing as a free lunch. There's no such thing as a free kosher lunch either. We have to pay for our freedoms, and paying for Jewish education, at least for the most part of Jewish education, is a price that, for better or worse, we have to pay for our continued status as first-class citizens.
Judaism is so many different things to so many different people. What does it mean to you, and how are its particular teachings relevant to your personal experience?
Once a prime minister of a country asked me why Jews are influential. And I said, because Jews care. When people care, they get involved. People who are involved can make a difference. People who are not involved can't make a difference. And we don't just care about our own, because we know a world that is indifferent to others will be indifferent to us. That a world that can see suffering and not care. So when Muslims suffered in Bosnia, the Jewish community mobilized. I said when the tsunami hit, there were countries whose foreign ministers were standing there and said, we don't take aid from Israel, and behind it you could see an El Al plane landing. Or the hurricanes in the south. What community mobilized more than the Jewish communities to provide aid and assistance? And I think you can find that true in every. So we care not just about our own. We care about the world. We care about making a difference. And I would hope that others could share in that and understand that joining these efforts means that we create a better and more secure future for all of our children.
I think there are universals. Certainly we have given the world the rule of law, the Ten Commandments, and what follows from the Ten Commandments. We've given the world the Torah. Everything is built on the Torah. The Christian Bible, the Muslim Quran is all built on the Torah.
I'm talking about the joys of Judaism, of what Jewish history teaches us, of what Jewish values are, of what our Torah shares with us, of the values of what it means in modern day, how relevant it is, more relevant than ever, and we learn much more about our sources, and we have so many texts available now in every language so that people who couldn't have learned before can learn today, can delve into it, find out what a Gemara has to offer. I know I meet lawyers who are not religious in other ways, but they study Gemara every day because of what it does for the mind, of what they learned from it, of the values, the ethics, the training for the mind even that they get from it.
When I see my students in first year criminal law, I can immediately tell who went to yeshiva. They come in with a tremendous competitive advantage. First of all, remember the Talmud is the first religious book in history ever to preserve dissenting opinions. So, we're not so certain that we're right in the majority. There's always an alternative. There's always another way. I'm reminded of Harry Truman's famous statement. He says, I want a lawyer with one hand. I've heard too much of on the one hand, on the other hand. I want a lawyer with one hand. In other words, he didn't want a Jewish lawyer, because Jewish lawyers understand there's always something on the one hand, there's always something on the other hand. If we had three hands, it would be on three hands.
There are some thinkers and philosophers whose definition of Judaism is Jewish creativity, its belief in moral values, ethics, humanism, democracy, and openness to other cultures. They may typically point to the numerous Nobel Prize winners that are or were of the Jewish faith in order to make their point. The question is this: are creativity, belief in moral values, ethics, humanism, etc., uniquely Jewish values? Did Jews invent them? What about the vast majority of Nobel Prize winners who were not Jewish? In other words, why the parochial or exclusive adherence to Jewish identity when we're all part of some universal pool, some kind of world culture? By this definition, we should be speaking of Jewish science, Jewish physics, Jewish medicine, Jewish mathematics, and so forth. How come we don't hear similar proposals for Catholic, Anglican, Baptist, or Presbyterian cultures? To put the question somehow differently, if you take the universalist approach, just who or what constitutes a Jew or Jewishness? It would have to come down to an individual's choice to identify as a Jew, whether he is or not. And in that case, you'd have to accept the so-called Hebrew Christians, or for that matter, all of Christianity, which defines itself as the New Israel. Obviously, that position is untenable. As the great sage Saadia Gaon said already more than 1,000 years ago, Judaism is defined solely by Torah, and without Torah as divine revelation, there are no such things as Jewish values or Jewish morality. Indeed, without religion, there are no real values or morals altogether. Without religion, you have nothing but situational ethics, relative morality, the transient fads that happen to be popular at any point in time. At best, you can talk about pragmatic utilitarianism, which is here today and gone tomorrow. It may be democratic, it may be practical and popular, but Judaism, it is not.
Finally, I asked our guests to tell us how the message of the Hanukkah story and the menorah's flames are relevant to us today.
Hanukkah has a universal message. It was the first real battle for religious freedom. And that message, that battle continues until today. And people shouldn't look at it as the Jews' battle any more than the struggle of Israel for survival, or Jews against anti-Semitism today. As many people said, this is not our problem. It's the Christians' problem. It's the Muslims' problem. It's their problem when they hate. They're the ones who ultimately pay the price for hate. We may pay the immediate price, but ultimately the world has always paid the price when hatred is allowed to go unchecked, because the first victims are never the last victims. And I think that the world should recognize that the battle against delegitimization of Israel is a battle about Western values. It's a battle about justice, freedom, democracy. It's the things that we all care about that come from the Judeo-Christian heritage, that come from the values that the Torah represents, that becomes the enemy. It's freedom, it's justice, it's the rights of people. And if they see it in that context, they will understand the need for everybody of goodwill to join in these fights, that it's not a struggle for us alone.
Hanukkah, which is of course the Festival of Lights, recalls the victory more than 2,000 years ago of a militarily weak but spiritually strong Jewish people over the mighty forces of a ruthless enemy that looked to engulf our land and our people in darkness. The miraculous conquest, which culminated with the rekindling of the menorah, which was desecrated, had been celebrated annually ever since, and it serves as a message of the triumph of freedom over oppression, of spirit over matter, of light over darkness. These Hanukkah lights are the first lesson in religious freedom. These lights stood as the first beacon against the forces of religious bigotry and persecution. The flames above the candles inspire those who are looking for freedom of the spirit in a land of precious liberty. And that's a very timely and reassuring message, because we live in a day and age where darkness prevails in the form of insidious erosion of time-honored values and principles that are the foundation of any decent society. And thus the Hanukkah lights remind us, in a most obvious way, that we have to brighten our lives with the glorious glow of spiritual illumination. We have to look to dispel whatever murky shadows, and we fill the void with rich and vibrant meaning and purpose.
I love Hanukkah because the story is such a wonderful one. It's a holiday of freedom, a holiday of rebellion, a holiday of assertiveness, a holiday of standing up to enemies, a holiday of cleansing. It has all the attributes of a holiday that Jews should love and Americans should love.
Everybody likes a Hanukkah present, so my Hanukkah message is a simple one. When you kindle that fire, look into the glow of the flame and see a very real reflection of your soul. Note how that flame flickers ever upward, just as your soul is constantly yearning for greater meaning and purpose.
Food's a very important part of our holidays too, and I can't wait every year until I get the latkes and play the dreidel with my grandchildren. So there are a lot of great joyous aspects of Hanukkah.
We intensify our efforts multifold in generating yet more light and more light still. And with enough of us doing that, each in our own slice of the world, we'll all be involved in lighting up our universe, and the ultimate brilliance of the divine radiance will shine bright once more, as everyone will sing together in perfect harmony when we merit universal salvation with the coming of Mashiach speedily. Frankly, there can be no greater Hanukkah present than that.
And on that note, I'd like to wish you all a very happy and bright Hanukkah. I'm Baila Olidort for Torah Cafe.
On a cold winter's day, on a busy city street, wearing tinted glasses and a night dog at his feet, sitting on a milk box, I'll tell you he looked strange. And to all the passers-by he said, can you spare a little change? I reached into my jacket, I gave him what I had. I know it wasn't much, but I'm sure I made him glad. He was staring at the floor as I walked away, but then I heard his tired voice turn to me and say, oh, all I really need now to see through the blindness. It's more random acts of goodness and kindness. Lend a helping hand, put a smile on your face. It's all we need to do to make the world a better place. He was standing in the mall, no more than 5 years old. From his big blue eyes, the bitter tears they roll. I cannot find my mother, and I don't know where I am. Well, come here, little fella, let me help you if I can. 'Cause all he really needs now to see through the blindness is more random acts of goodness and kindness. Lend a helping hand, put a smile on your face. It's all we need to do to make the world a better place. So go and volunteer and do a favor here and there. Walk up to a perfect stranger and let him know you care. Help the lady with her bags and the person dressed in rags. Give a child a better start and do it from the heart. It's all they really need now to see through the blindness. It's more random acts of goodness and kindness. Lend a helping hand, put a smile on your face. It's all we need to do to make the world a better place. And in a world so disillusioned, where we don't know wrong from right, it's as if we've all gone blind and lost our sight. We don't need no walking stick to guide us through our day. Just put your hand in mine, and together we'll pave the way. It's all